All right, good morning and welcome to Business Lens on Rapid TV. I'm Faith Dafford-Joseph. And of course, on the show, we get to look at headlines making the rounds in the world of business and finance. So in the headlines today, what are we talking about? The Minister of State for Industry, Trade and Investment, John Owen Anuoh, has said that the country must grow its economy by at least 7% to 10% annually if it hopes to achieve President Bola Tinubu's 1 trillion GDP target. All right, and of course, let's go to the next headline. The Director General of the Nigerian Employers Consultative Association, that's NECA, Adewale Oyerinde, he has said that the private sector remains Nigeria's largest employer of labor. Okay, and another headline that we're looking at for today says Dangote Refinery in Nigeria has begun sourcing crude oil from Ghana to diversify its supply chain. We'll tell you more about that as we go on. And petrol consumption nationwide has also fallen by 28% over the past 2 years. This is a report by the NMDPRA. We'll give you the details of that as we go on as well. Also, well, in the news, the president is claiming that the economy has stabilized, and he says nobody's trading a piece of paper for an exchange rate anymore. He talks about the naira being 1,900 to $1 when he took over in May 2023. So is that true? We also get to verify that particular claim. Okay, and then later on we get into the topic for the day. We get to talk about, well, the 5% new, is it fossil fuel tax that will be part of the harmonized tax law starting in 2026. So stick around. This is Business Lens on Rapid TV. After the break, we'll give you more details.
The global markets. What does it all mean for you? From stock market insights to global financial news you need to know. From Wall Street to the main street and, of course, the marketplace.
Get the answers you need every week on Business Lens with me, Faith Dafford-Joseph, as I bring into focus the stories, strategies, and shifts shaping our economy. No angle is missed as I talk about the business, the people, patterns, and possibilities behind them. Welcome to the Business Lens.
All right, welcome back. It's still the Business Lens on Rapid TV. Let's quickly get to the stories for today. So, like I said earlier, the Minister of Trade for Industry, Trade and Investment, that's John Owen Anuoh, he says the country must grow its economy by at least 7% to 10% annually if it hopes to achieve President Bola Tinubu's $1 trillion GDP target. Now, the president has talked about this a lot, that he's aiming for a $1 trillion, economy. Well, the minister is warning that the current growth rate of about 3%, because if you look at Nigeria's, growth, GDP rate averagely is about 3%. It says it's inadequate, and he's stressing that industrialization is the only path to sustainable prosperity. Well, he also goes on to talk about there's a new industrialization plan, so we'll see how that pans out. Let's go to the very next, story we're looking at, where the Director General of the Nigerian Employers Consultative Association, that's NECA, Adewale Oyerinde, he says that the private sector remains Nigeria's largest employer of labor. Quoting him, he says it is an error to think that the government is the biggest employer in Nigeria, and he says it doesn't agree with that, saying the private sector remains the biggest employer of labor. And he's challenging the view that the government employs more Nigerians, stressing that private businesses sustain both direct and indirect employment on a much larger scale. In fact, if we look at the numbers, we know that for the federal government, there's about 72,000 public servants on the payroll. Well, if you go on to state governments, numbers get to increase. But does that mean the government is the biggest employer of labor? Well, he totally disagrees with that. Dangote Refinery says it has begun sourcing crude oil from Ghana to diversify its supply chain. Okay, this is very interesting because we also know that Dangote Refinery, there was a time it was also crude from the US, from Brazil, from everywhere. Now it looks like Ghana is the next place. The refinery says it is increasing its production rate. And now report says it has reached about 610,000 barrels per day in August. That means that it's approaching its full capacity of 650,000. In fact, there were reports that it might actually be able to go over that number come December. So we'll see how that pans out, as well. Let's talk about the fact that petrol consumption nationwide has also fallen by 28% over the past 2 years. There's a number of things that can be responsible for that. But what the story is saying is that pump attendants at cross filling stations, they said they are left with scanty vehicular calls. And if you look at the latest figures from the Nigerian Midstream and Downstream Petroleum Regulatory Authority, that's the NMDPRA, it shows that the daily volume of PMS dropped from 68,353 million litres in June 2023, when you had fuel subsidy removed, to 49.277 million litres in June 2025. There can be a number of ways to explain that. Maybe people are no longer taking their cars out, probably because, well, fuel is not too expensive, right? But let's talk about this story that has been trending. The video is all over the place. I don't know if you have seen it, where the president is claiming that the economy has stabilized. That maybe can no longer be disputed, because we also had the Director General for the WTO saying that, well, the economy has stabilized because of macroeconomic indices that have shown that. But the president also went on to say that nobody's trading a piece of paper for an exchange rate anymore. But here's a claim that got people talking. It says, when I took over, it was 1,900 to $1. It is 1,450 naira now. It's been stabilizing. You don't have to know Cardoso before you get your exchange rate. So let's look at that video where the president said that, he met the naira at $1.
Or exchange rate anymore. When I took over, 1.9, it's 1.35, 1.45 now. It's been stabilizing there. People can predict. You don't have to know a Cardoso before you get your foreign exchange, you get your imports.
All right, so is that claim true? I mean, when the president says you don't need to know a Cardoso before you get your foreign exchange, that you can say, is true, because when the CBN governor came in, he did a lot of reforms where that is concerned. He eliminated the multiple exchange rates that we had during the Emefiele regime. But is it now was it $1,900 to $1 when the president took over in 2023? Here's a report from Bloomberg at the time as well, showing exactly how much it was at the time. Okay, and to just give you the details of that, under the former CBN governor Emefiele, Nigeria operated a multiple exchange rate system. The official rate was 450 naira to $1 and 700 naira to $1 at the parallel market. So why did the president make this statement exactly? It's a question to ask, because we do know that there has been some sort of stability when you talk about FX exchange rate. Multiple exchange rates windows has been eliminated. And if you look at what we have, what you used to call the parallel market, it's probably what you can call the retail market now, because you can see that the disparity has been totally reduced, right? But when the president took over, it wasn't 1,900 to $1. It was 450 naira to $1 at the official window. And then the parallel markets, there was a huge disparity, about 700 to 750. That was what it was. So yes, the question still remains, why exactly is the president saying this when at the end of the day, a lot of experts will argue that it is not necessarily the value of the naira, but its stability, the certainty. In that part, he is correct, that there is certainty. You don't need to know the governor of the central bank to get your dollars. But that figure, it just doesn't seem right if you look at the records. Anyway, stick around, stay with us. We still have to talk about this 5% surcharge on locally produced petroleum products. And that's coming up right after the break. I'll be joined by public affairs analysts to talk about what that means come 2026 when the new tax law takes effect. We'll talk about that. Stay with Rapid TV. All right, still the business lens on Rapid TV. We're talking about this 5% surcharge on locally produced petroleum products. Okay, so we do know that in the new tax reform bill that has now been passed into law that will take effect in January 2026, we have also this particular tax. Now, the price of petrol and diesel may experience a sharp rise when the federal government begins the implementation of the 2025 Nigeria Tax Administration Act. Okay, so Nigeria announced this 5% tax on all fossil fuel sales as part of its new tax law. And according to this new tax regulation, Nigerians now expected to pay a 5% surcharge that is chargeable on fossil fuel products provided or produced in Nigeria. This is a fee which, according to the stipulation of the Act, shall be collected at the time of a chargeable transaction, meaning at the point of sale. Now, this surcharge excludes clean or renewable energy products such as household kerosene, cooking gas, or CNG, that's compressed natural gas. The question, of course, is why would Nigeria, a fossil fuel producing nation with less than 5% of carbon print, go the route of a carbon tax? I'm joined by Mr. Ayodele Lawal Adio, who is a public affairs analyst, to talk about this. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Faith. It's good to be here.
All right, I'm pretty sure that you have probably seen this report and, of course, the different criticism or controversy that it has generated. What is very interesting, though, is that when, this bill was passed and we had Mr. Taiwo Oyedele talk about, all the benefits that comes with this bill, it felt like this was overlooked. So let's start with that first. Why do you think that, this didn't catch the attention of the public until now, that we now have the bill passed and is now a law that will take effect from 2026?
Well, I would imagine it was because the committee focused on the benefits of the bill, which started with, the focus on the harmonization of all tax, whether it was state, federal, or local government taxes. And that harmonization was going to lead to reduced taxes, across board. And that was sold as, reduced taxation for most Nigerian citizens. So that was a good sell to the more liquidity for businesses and was going to free up more funding for investments and perhaps hiring in the next few years. So these were good selling points upon which, the proposed, or in fact, the past tax reform bill was hinged on. So I think, and the distribution of VAT and consumption tax at the time, where northern states were in a running battle with how the distribution was going to happen. So that soaked a lot of public attention, and very few people paid attention to the details of the bill. And so things like, the surcharge on petrol sort of sneaked under the rug, and many people didn't pay attention to some of these details that is now becoming, clear and visible, that we have to be dealing with, certain kinds of increases in the next few months, to come. So I would argue that it was because, of the debates that happened with the consumption tax, and of course, obviously, the fact that those who were selling the bill focused on its benefits. And of course, if you want to sell something, you obviously would focus on the benefits and not the side effects. So, and hence, a lot of us didn't pay attention to some of the details and the nitty-gritty of the bill, which obviously is now rearing its ugly head.
So let's talk about, this 5% surcharge. One of the things that also stands out is about how it is going to be promoting clean energy or renewable energy. Let's talk about that. If you look at the carbon footprint of Nigeria? I mean, I think it's actually also less than 0.08%, you know. So why is Nigeria going this route, really? Is that just a way to sell it? Or is it about, you know, generating revenue for the government? Because we do know that this government is very big on revenue generation, right? So subsidy has been removed. We're paying more for fuel. And then this is, well, I say sort of sneaked in so that for every liter of petrol that you buy, you are going to be paying this. So whether it's petrol or diesel, you get to pay this. So is it that as a petroleum producing nation, you know, we have such high carbon footprint in the world that we have to now promote renewable energy, and this is a way to wean Nigerians of, you know, fossil fuels? Do we need that? And is this what this is about?
Again, I must say I'm tired of these debates about renewables and renewable energy, because clearly no country has ever industrialized with renewable energy, and you're going to find it difficult to drive manufacturing on renewable energy. And so the truth is, you know, as a country that is struggling to industrialize and to drive its manufacturing sector to create hundreds of thousands of jobs, we cannot be stuck on this debate about eliminating fossil fuel or, you know, frustrating fossil fuel in exchange for renewable energy, particularly as a macroeconomic factor. I mean, if the argument is about increasing access to energy supply and electricity supply, then we can make the argument about adopting renewables, particularly in rural communities, to expand energy access to vulnerable and left behind communities. But as a factor of driving production or macroeconomic development, I think it's a very silly, if not lazy, argument to make, because even some of the countries that we seem to be borrowing this lingua from or these catchphrases from aren't, you know, are beginning to double down on fossil fuel, right, to power industrialization and to obviously provide support for business growth. So I think that's a lazy argument to make. But to the second point about, you know, revenue generation, of course, yeah, that's the major point, because this will be bringing close to 800 billion a year to the federal government's coffers, and that's a lot of monies that can go into spending to drive whatever policies or whatever initiatives that the federal government is bent on. So I think that liquidity is really the driving point for this. They really need to ramp up revenue to see through some of the ambitious agenda that they want to drive. So I'd rather have that this argument is hinged on the fact that this will free up about 800 billion for the federal government, for them to put back in infrastructural development or whatever project that they want to drive, and make a sensible argument to the Nigerian people of what they are going to do with these, you know, excess or increased liquidity that they are going to get from this surcharge. And if they can make a convincing argument of where they are going to put this, you know, extra 800 billion is now left for the Nigerian people to decide whether it or whether, you know, they are willing to deal with higher prices or higher energy costs as a trade-off for whatever benefit is going to come from the 800 billion investments in a year. So that's the argument that they should be making, and that should be the entire argument of this entire surcharge, not renewable energy, because it's a very silly and lazy argument.
Let's talk about, you know, being able to divert the funds. When subsidy was taking off in 2023, when the president came in and said subsidy is now gone, one of the argument was that whatever was taking off subsidy was going to help in infrastructural development, right? It was going to help, you know, we're going to channel this monies that we're paying for subsidy to create more infrastructure and to help develop the economy. We have hardly seen that happen. So even that argument, do you think maybe the government sees that this might fall flat? That's why they're going the renewable energy route, because if you couldn't channel whatever it is you were getting after subsidy to infrastructure development, what is the guarantee that you're going to channel it now from this fossil fuel tax?
Well, I think you have your fingers right on the button, because the truth is nobody's going to believe them that they're going to channel these monies into projects or initiatives that will benefit the average Nigerian, because the evidence over the last 2 years at least hasn't shown that the government is committed into redistributing these resources in a way that helps to cushion the cost of living crisis that many households are experiencing across the country. And that is going to be a Herculean task for them to sell over the next coming weeks, because the truth is, if you look at government spending and government priorities, it's been geared towards funding the vanities of public office holders rather than cushioning the effect of inflation and cushioning the effect of some of the bold reforms that this administration has been pursuing. And that really and truly creates a lot of doubt in the minds of many Nigerians that if we give you another 800 billion a year and have to carry this burden, would you not be buying new SUVs for yourself? Wouldn't you be flying business classes, perhaps even funding new private jets and international travels, and all of that? And the average Nigerian is not going to get anything, from this bargain. And that for me is the fundamental challenge here, that we haven't really demonstrated that from, some of the huge revenue surplus that we have been generating, the announcements that have followed, the fact that we have met our revenue goals, it hasn't really translated to tangible benefits that we can see and say that, we can see that our roads have become a huge construction sites. We can see, investments in affordable housing across the country. We haven't seen, especially if you remember, the president promised about 78 billion for small businesses across the country as support. The paltry 78 billion, naira hasn't been released to most businesses across the country. All we've seen are cosmetic donations from the office of the first ladies. And you just haven't seen some sort of a coherent strategy to actually help boost, demand on the side of consumers and to provide sustainable support, for households who are crushing under the weight of heavy inflation, and this huge cost of living. And that is really a problem. It's really a problem. And then to now burden them with another 5% surge, your guess is as good as mine as to what is going to happen over the next few months.
Okay, so one of the things that, one of the headlines that I took, we talked about how, attendants at different petrol stations are saying that there's less vehicular traffic now. They're making less money because a lot of people are not even taking their cars out, because if you look at how much you have to spend to put fuel in your car every month, it is huge, right? And the average Nigerian, what is their salary? We have reports talking about less than how many percent of Nigerians making 200,000 naira a month. So you introduce this now, and it's supposed to take place from next year. Okay, so how are Nigerians supposed to cope with this? When you look at, the poverty level, you look at income level, is this showing some sort of insensitivity from the government where this is concerned to impose an extra tax on Nigerians on something that they need to use every day to literally survive?
So I'll be honest with you, and I would argue that it's very insensitive and it's poorly thought out. And it's also poorly sequenced. If it's going to go in the first quarter of next year, certain arguments have been made. It would also be very poorly sequenced. And let me say that political stability or the political economy is as equally as important as macroeconomics, especially when your country is going through a currency crisis or a shortage in demand. And that is largely because in the bid to deal with your problems, which is a currency crisis like we have been going through, you are likely to push your country over the edge, with certain kinds of policies that really technically are correct, but will lead to larger problems for your economy and will lead to a failure of that reform that you had sought out to solve in the first instance. And examples abound across the world, because we're going through exactly the same thing that the Asians went through in 1997 when there was a currency crisis, particularly in Thailand. And they also pursued similar policies that we're pursuing today. They cut spending in subsidies, they restructured government spending, they got a bailout from the IMF, they pursued certain level of austerities. But guess what followed? A huge crisis, protests, riots across the country that brought everything to a complete halt. It even forced the president at the time, Surato, who had been in office for 32 years, and forced him to resign. And what followed was that the government was compelled to bring back certain levels of subsidies which were targeted, particularly kerosene subsidies for the rural communities, rice subsidies for poor households. They provide jobs, to do some of the things that government would have contracted to major organizations, some sort of a Keynesian model, if you like. And that led to stability such that by 2000, just 2 years after pursuing these reforms, the country had gone back to a growth of 5% a year, right? So it's exactly the same crisis that we're going through now. And we're also pursuing the same kinds of solutions that were pursued by the Asians at the time. The difference is that we are not learning from the consequence of those austerities and how they were able to mitigate the fallout, of the policies that they were pursuing, particularly with giving or providing social safety nets for a majority of the citizens that were going to be going through that hardship. And so in this case also, what we're doing is to raise energy costs, which has been one of the primary drivers of inflation in the country. Because if you looked at, the rise in electricity tariffs and obviously the rise in petrol cost over the last 2 years, they have been primarily responsible for the rise in the cost of food items, for transportation, and has put a lot of pressure and burden on households. So if you do another 5% surcharge, what you're really going to do is to crush consumer demand, which will obviously affect the manufacturing sector, in fact, even the service sector, which is likely going to lead to further job losses and which is likely going to lead to a depression in the economy. So it makes no sense to pursue a policy that is likely to be inflationary, that is likely to reduce demand, that is likely to shrink consumption, and more importantly, that is likely to derail some of the benefits that the administration has been getting, from its reforms. And I repeat that the political economy is as important as macroeconomics. And it's important that they pay attention that the fact that Nigerians are not on the streets protesting this hardship should be enough signal to the current administration that there's enough good faith and enough social capital that they are filtering away, and may likely come back to hurt them if they pursue, in my opinion, this senseless 5% surcharge in a bid to pursue more revenue in the coming year. It will be senseless, and they are likely to risk, what the Asians experience in terms of, massive social unrest because people could no longer cope with the burden of those austerity measures. So it's important that, they are a lot more sensitive, like you alluded to earlier, and sequence these policies better. I think that a more sensible approach will be to show, really and truly, so far, like you said earlier on, what the benefits have been over the last 2 years from some of the savings that have been made. Of course, also, another sensible approach would be also to harmonize these taxes across federal, state, and local governments, such that citizens can see that they are really and truly now paying lower taxes, and then you can then strategically and gradually, start to bite the bullet in some of these other more painful, decisions. But to do them at once and to sequence them in the way and manner that they seek to do, I think it would just be very silly to do.
I mean, let's talk about, the way they have been doing this. When the president came in 2023, the subsidies gone announcement was made. And then I think it was in June, we now had, the eradication of multiple multiple FX windows, where you now had even the sort of subsidy on the FX taking out as well. I mean, many would argue that there is still defense of the currency going on. In fact, I think it was a couple of months ago, Bismarck Rouhani you know, a well-known economist was talking about the CBN still defending the Naira. And so there's an argument about that, right? But the government undertook these things almost at the same time. And then you also had electricity subsidies taking off as well, where we now had, you know, the Band-Aid thing introduced and part of the subsidy taking off for that. But let's also now talk about the fact that the government is saying that there's going to be subsidy taking. I mean, there's not going to be this 5% surcharge on CNG or, you know, even kerosene and things like that. But if you look at even the price of CNG now, that has gone up as well. You're looking at standard cubic meter of CNG jumping from about 230 Naira to 450. That means that the subsidy has been quietly removed on that as well. So even if you're saying that there won't be a surcharge paid on that, we still know that the price of CNG has gone up. So what exactly is the benefit? If you're saying that this taxes are going to be part of renewable energy, but renewable energy has also gone up. So what is the upside? What are the people getting?
Well, I mean, that's the question that many Nigerians will be asking. Listen, you know, governance is about choices, right? And you sometimes, you know, you sometimes run the numbers and take certain kinds of risks depending on the kinds of reforms that you want to pursue, right? So I'm guessing when the president got in almost 2 years ago, firstly, we must admit that the previous administration dealt him a bad hand. The country was broke, the economy had been badly mismanaged, there was mounting debts. And so the president had very few choices to make, really and truly. So there was no escaping the fact that there were going to be austerity measures. There was no escaping the fact that government spending had to be restructured. And there was no escaping, really and truly, the fact that we needed to harmonize, you know, the forex windows. There was no escaping these things. And so this through aggressively over 2 years, and I have 2 years to buy without Nigerians flooding the streets and you know, protesting and their social unrest. In 2 years, I should have been able to save a sizable amount of money that by the time Nigerians are getting to their breaking point, I can pour back some of these monies back into the economy that buys me some sort of political will and sort of ease the pressure of the Nigerian people, right? So that is typically the kind of thinking that goes on in government, especially in policy making, when you have to take very difficult decisions. You need to find that balancing act, you know, between taking the very tough decisions that you have to make and realizing that you're not dealing with just statistics and pie charts and tables, you're dealing with real human beings, right? So in the first instance, I'll argue that the president has been extremely lucky that he's done all of these things at once, where many of us had argued that you're better off sequencing these things. But he's beaten the bullet and done all of these things at once, which gave him at least 2 years, right, of removing petrol subsidy, raising electricity tariffs, and taking all of these hard decisions, right? The question now is, you've had 2 years of a holiday, essentially. Can you show the Nigerian people the benefits from these 2 years of holidays that you have had, and show them where these savings have gone to? But unfortunately, I just don't see the evidence. Now, again, it's also important to put a balance here that yes, there has been stability in the forex. Yes, our monetary policy is going in the right direction. There isn't as much capital flight as there was. There's a sizable amount of portfolio investments coming into the economy, albeit in comparison to FDIs is not a good look, but foreign portfolio investments are coming in. So there's a lot of stability happening on the monetary side. But these are, what's the word here? You're going into an operation, for instance, and the doctor says, we want to stabilize the patient. That the patient is stabilized doesn't mean that the patient can walk out of the hospital or that the patient is back to great health. It is just what it is, that the patient is stabilized, you know, for better treatment to go on. So that we have stabilized, you know, foreign exchange and monetary policy doesn't mean that the living standard of the average Nigerian has improved. In fact, data shows that today, Faith, in terms of per capita income, the average Nigerian is 2 times poorer than a Ghanaian and almost 3 times poorer than an Ivorian.
Okay.
It's ridiculous to talk about it, right?
Let's talk about the fact that, because I was asking you about the CNG, right? The government touted CNG as the better alternative for Nigerians. If you are going to be winning people off fossil fuel and you're saying that CNG is a better alternative, it's cheaper. But like I said, the subsidy of CNG has also been taking off. That has now increased to about 450 naira, per standard cubic meter, right? So that is there. And you also had the government talking about, it feels like they've stalled on that, about banning the importation of solar panels. So the renewables or the alternative to fossil fuel, it feels like they're also getting some sort of increase in purchase, but you're telling us that, well, we're trying to win you off fossil fuels, so that's why you're paying this 5%. But CNG has gone up and you are planning a ban on importation of solar panels. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, I think the question you have to even ask is how much of our economy is powered on CNG. And I'm talking public transportation, I'm talking household transportation, business and all of that. How much of the economy is powered on CNG? I'm willing to bet on you that percentage will be lucky if we could get to 1.5% of the Nigerian economy, right? So the impact is minimal, almost negligible, if you ask me. And so the argument that you're winning Nigerians off, to adopt CNG, I think, again, you've had 18 months to implement a clear CNG strategy that, in my opinion, has spectacularly failed because adoption has peaked. Not a lot of Nigerians are adopting CNG as we speak, largely because the infrastructure doesn't exist across the country. There hasn't been enough investment in the infrastructure to allow the distribution of these CNG products. There hasn't been confidence that they can drive to a nearby filling station and refill their tanks with CNG. So the infrastructure doesn't exist, and in my opinion, to a very large extent, the policy has failed. When this policy was touted, I thought that it was going to be targeted specifically at public transportation, and to a very large extent, to see a situation where they could bring down the prices of public transportation across the country. To that extent, it would have been a spectacular success. But the implementation has been haphazard. It's had no impact whatsoever on the price of public transportation across the country. It's had no impact whatsoever on household expenditure, especially with energy costs. So to say or to suggest that it's being a success such that you're also imposing a tax on petrol to win people off to CNG as an alternative where the infrastructure does not exist, I think is very, very laughable, in my opinion. And so that argument should not be canvassed going forward, especially because really and truly, you just have to look at your window to ask the question if this policy is in existence anywhere, and you'd find the answer, very easily. So again, you have to look at what impacts the majority of Nigerians, and that really and truly is fossil fuel, is petrol. And diesel, petrol for households, diesel for businesses, and that really has impacted, cost of living, the cost of doing business, and by extension, the cost of goods and services, and has been largely inflationary. So it makes no sense to be dealing with something that impacts almost less than 1.5% of the economy, and leave, the more than 98%, in a complete limbo. It just makes no sense to me.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Ayodele Lawal Adio, for joining in the conversation today and helping us make sense of this. That is as much as we can take from that. Thank you so much for being a part of the show.
Thank you, Faith. It's good to be here. All
right, then, and that is how we wrap up the conversation for today. Of course, now you do know that come 2026, January, you might be paying a lot more for fuel, a lot more for diesel. But there are some benefits to the tax law, so maybe that's will complement it. Well, we'll see. My name is Faith Dafa Joseph. Enjoy the rest of your day.